And welcome back. While democratic participation can take place in many forms, including organizing our communities, advocating for issues, and protesting unjust policies and systems, the act of voting is one of the most important tools for ensuring our elected leaders reflect our communities and values and govern our interests. Unfortunately, ensuring that every such person can vote remains an elusive goal in our democracy. Every election, large numbers of eligible voters are denied their fundamental right to vote due to imprisonment or being on parole. Registration barriers do not affect communities equally. Voter registration today disproportionately blocks Black and brown would-be voters from exercising their fundamental right to vote. Joining us now to provide her point of view on this matter, I'm joined by the Senior Counsel at Demos, Naila Awan, and thank you so much for being with us, Naila.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, and so as we talk about, November, which is literally right around the corner. I know you're fastened and locked right in on it. Give us your thoughts about what you see and what you want to see happen as we move closer to that date.
Yeah, I mean, I think as we're looking towards November, there's obviously an enormous amount of litigation that's happening right now, an enormous number of rules that are in question, and people who are going to be navigating the absentee voting processes for the first time. So, I think that my main hope heading into November is one, that folks are requesting their ballots early, that they are checking to make sure that they are received if they're sending them in by mail, and that there's not deficiencies in them. And then also, there's a huge amount of work right now that's happening to try to get poll worker recruitment in different states, because that is what we saw led to the consolidation of polling locations and enormously long lines during the primaries. And so that is another thing that, kind of stands at top of mind with respect to this November's election and how it's going to play out.
Yeah, and we know that even as we're getting closer, the voter registration deadline is fast approaching. But a little bit about your efforts and your thoughts about voter registration.
Sure. So, I heard you mention earlier about how voter registration serves as a barrier, particularly for certain communities, particularly Black and brown communities. And the thing is, it's not a coincidence, right? It was designed that way. The first voter registration procedures really began to be adopted in the late 19th century in response to increases in immigration and the enfranchisement of former slaves. And so, this year in particular, as we're seeing people face an eviction crisis where their addresses might be changing, as we're seeing the fact that grassroots organizations that tend to really conduct GOTV in Black and brown communities have been stalled from being able to do the sort of on the ground efforts like they normally do because of the COVID-19 pandemic. I think, now more than ever, it's important for people to be checking their registration status and registering to vote or updating their registration if needed. Something that we've seen time and time again is a lot of times people think I'm registered in this state and that's all I need to worry about. But actually, if you've moved, you do have to have your registration updated so that you can vote at your new address. Otherwise, you're potentially subjecting yourself to disenfranchisement based on where you move to within a state. And those laws differ from one state to the next, but it's just incredibly important to make sure that your registration is updated and current before the voter registration deadline hits.
Yeah, and as we know, for many people, we have to overcome these barriers, particularly communities of color, and we know that there's a lot of voter suppression that's going on out there. Talk a little bit about your work in dealing with that, the issue of voter suppression, and really having access to ballot voting.
Sure. So, I mean, we've seen voter suppression issues pop up in any number of circumstances. And, a few of the things that I've personally worked on have dealt with things like the elimination or attempted elimination of early voting opportunities, such as evening and weekend hours, which people who tend to be hourly and wage workers or who don't have flexible work schedules rely on to be able to vote. Or the targeting of Sunday voting, which a lot of Black churches have organized around for Souls to the Polls to take their congregations to go vote. And there have been concentrated efforts in some states over the past number of years to try to eliminate some of those opportunities. Similarly, things like the consolidation of polling places that tend to happen predominantly in Black and brown communities or disproportionately happen in those communities mean that people who might have been able to walk to their polling place at one point now might have to drive to it. And when you're looking at the fact that in a number of states, if you look at the data, people who are in communities of color tend to be less likely to own a vehicle or less likely to have a vehicle for each member of their family who drives. That can be or is of driving age, that could be an enormous burden as well. Then if you think about things like the impact that has on lines at polling locations and people's ability to wait in those lines, or the fact that voter ID laws tend to also disproportionately disenfranchise Black and brown voters, those all kind of compound on what some of these voter suppression efforts are. And one of the other issues that has really seen a resurgence in recent years is the issue of voter purges. And
Right.
what I would say about that is, one, in places like Ohio, where we litigated, the state uses inactivity over a period of time to indicate that a voter may have moved and start a process of removing them from the registration rolls. But when people have a number of factors that are already reducing the likelihood that they are able to make it to the polls and cast a ballot, disproportionately Black and brown people, what that means is that those individuals are more likely to be swept up into that process and removed from the rolls, despite the fact that their eligibility did not change. Then you also see targeting of predominantly Black communities for purges. For instance, in 2015 in Sparta, Georgia, you had the Hancock County Board of Elections decide to send out deputies with summonses to, I think it was about 17% of the population in the city of Sparta, telling them they had to appear and defend their registration status in order to stay on the registration rolls. And almost every single one of the people who was provided those summonses was Black.
Mm. One of the things we're also dealing with too is the issue of getting some clarity, because one of the demographics that we have to talk about with regards to voting are particularly those who've been incarcerated and those with felonies. A lot of misconception. Can you please clear it up? Who's allowed to vote? Who's not allowed to vote when it comes to parole and probation?
So here's the problem, is that it differs enormously from one state to another. And
Right.
what the general assumption is by individuals is that if you've had a felony conviction in your past, that you're permanently barred from being able to vote. And the reason is that people are most familiar with the most restrictive rules like that used to exist in Florida, despite the fact that in their state, perhaps they can vote immediately upon releasing from incarceration, right? It really differs from state to state. Some states, permanently bar someone from voting. Some states say upon completion of probation or parole. Some states say upon release from incarceration. Some say upon completion of terms of sentence, which could mean the payment of certain legal financial obligations. Others might actually have different rules based on the felony that you may have been convicted for, or if it was a first felony conviction versus a second felony conviction. So it's really this patchwork of rules that creates a lot of voter confusion. And I would say too that here as well, these practices were not, they don't by coincidence disproportionately disenfranchise Black and brown voters. They were actually a response to the abolition of property holding requirements designed to reduce the political participation of Black voters. So if you actually look at how some of these laws developed in the South, right? For instance, in the state of Mississippi, they targeted crimes that Black voters were more likely to be prosecuted for than white voters. So if someone committed murder, something that white voters were more likely to be prosecuted for, they retained their right to vote. If they committed an act of theft, something Black voters were more likely to be convicted for, they lost their voting rights. And really, if you look today, there are 2 states out of the US's 50 states that never strip an individual of their right to vote, regardless of felony conviction, and they remain able to vote while in prison. And those 2 states are Maine and Vermont. Something that I think is not a coincidence that they are also the ones, if you look at census block data or census data, are the 2 whitest states in the country.
So now, give me this. I mean, we've got a lot of challenges as we head towards November. Of course, a lot of obstacles to try to overcome. The major obstacle that everybody's talking about and we've got to deal with is the one that hits us front and center, which is COVID-19 and the impact of COVID-19, particularly in communities of color, and then also not just in communities of color, but just literally state and nationwide. How do we see COVID-19 potentially playing an impact in the voter turnout?
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's something that we all have reason to be concerned about. One, there's already the item we hit earlier about the fact that registration efforts were halted in a lot of communities. And so the impact that has on the ability of individuals to vote is direct, right? If they aren't registered, they're not going to be able to vote. So that could depress numbers. You're also looking at an election where for the first time, a lot of people are going to be trying to vote remotely by like absentee or mail ballot. And the studies show that people who are first-time voters, who are Black voters, are more likely to have their absentee ballots rejected for errors. And I think, based on my experience working with a number of grassroots organizations, a lot of Black-led grassroots organizations have indicated their members and the communities they work with oftentimes go to vote in person because they like to see the ballot being counted and cast. And it's something that folks have had to struggle and work to achieve that right. And they like to go and exercise it in person. So you're having like a number of people who are not used to having to navigate these mail voting processes that are going to have to do so for the first time this year, when really even minor errors on these ballots can result in rejection. And not all states require that individuals be provided notice and an opportunity to correct those errors. So, that is deeply problematic. I think it was a study by USA Today, Columbia Journalism Investigations, and PBS Frontline that said that taking kind of a low threshold, if 50% of our nation votes by mail, they're estimating that at least 1.03 million absentee ballots could be rejected in this election.
And that's huge, given the fact that, first of all, the numbers last time, and when we look at the numbers last time, of course, President Trump winning in the popular vote, but yet and still losing in the popular vote, winning in the Electoral College. And then you also have the statistic where 53% of eligible American voters did not hit the polls. Are we looking at voter apathy this time around, or do you think that people are going to be very more engaged based on the fact of all that we're seeing across our nation?
I think it's hard to predict exactly what's going to happen, because I definitely think that people are concerned about the COVID-19 pandemic. At the same point, we're not having the level of engagement around the presidential debates and election that you normally have when you're not in the midst of a pandemic. But we are in a very specific moment in our country where folks have been mobilized. There is a massive grassroots movement happening right now, and there is, I think, real concerns about how this election is going to play out, as well as I feel like the fact that voter suppression efforts have been so frontline in the news right now actually could motivate people more to say, like, no, you're not going to take my vote away, and I'm going to exercise it. So my hope is that we see higher turnout. I think that, it's still to be seen, though.
Yeah. What can be done if we're looking at our current electoral process, helping out, particularly in communities of color? What do you think would be of great advantage to communities of color in a time such as this when we talk about voting?
Well, so if we're talking about this election coming up, I will say I think that having more people volunteer with like election protection who are from different communities, like from the communities they're actually assisting people in, is like enormously helpful. And the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law does a nonpartisan election protection like effort that folks could look into volunteering at. I think needing more poll workers from like communities is also going to be big and important to helping folks, and like having someone that is from a community or who may speak the language that someone who's visiting a polling site speaks can be enormously helpful in helping people navigate the voting process. And then if we're talking about what reforms are needed and stuff too, I think that there are a number of things like that that are like longer term solutions, such as making sure that there's like same day registration, which a number of states have already, where you can go to the polls, register to vote or update your registration and vote in person, right? And it's kind of a one-stop voting shop. And I think that things like that are enormously important to ensuring that individuals aren't disenfranchised based on their registration not being up to date or because they've been purged from the rolls or for a variety of other reasons.
If I get to the polls and I say, listen, I'm here to cast my vote, but then I've got an election worker, a polling worker telling me, no, I can't do that here, or there's some sort of controversy, what are the options that's available? We've heard advocates say, stay at the polls, cast your ballot, and then at the same time, we'll work it out later.
Yeah, I mean, so I will say, I think that one, you can always contact election protection. There is a national hotline, 866 our vote, that folks can call and seek assistance with if they're experiencing any difficulties. Also, everyone has a right to cast a provisional ballot. And sometimes poll workers don't actually offer that up. I know people who have been told their names aren't on the registration rolls and are never offered a provisional ballot, but everyone should insist at the very least to be handed a provisional ballot at the polling site if they're being told they cannot otherwise vote.
Mm-hmm. So what's it going to be like for you over the next couple of weeks as we get closer towards Election Day? Talk about the work that you'll be doing over the next couple of weeks.
Sure. So right now we're kind of knee deep in a lawsuit in Missouri dealing with how individuals are going to be able to return their mail-in ballots in the state, dealing with certain restrictions that the state has placed on mail-in voters. And that is on a fast track appeal at the 8th Circuit Court of Appeals. The district court found in our favor on one of the issues last Friday, and we're already getting ready for 8th Circuit litigation to hopefully resolve the issues as soon as possible so that voters know what options are available for them to return their ballots well in advance of November 3rd.
And for somebody who doesn't know about your organization, real quick, give us a little bit about your organization.
Sure. Demos is a national nonprofit that focuses on democracy and economic justice with a focus on racial equity. So all of our work seeks to address issues that disproportionately impact Black and Brown voters and Black and Brown individuals. And we have a litigation team, a campaigns team, a policy and research team, and a communications team, and really utilize all of those prongs to work to advance progressive reforms and do that in deep partnership with local grassroots organizations that work at the state and local levels.
Well, thank you so much for coming and sharing today, Naila, about the work that's going on. And certainly as we get closer towards Election Day, a lot is going to be hanging in the balance. But we certainly want to make sure that our viewers are aware of all the things that they can do to make sure they have their vote counted. And most of all, the people really get out to vote. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you.
All righty.